The tales of two mothers in the village of Umuaja, a small town in southeastern Nigeria, where traditions and belief run deep. Two women found themselves heavily pregnant, due for delivery at a crossroad that would change their lives forever. It was a hot, humid afternoon when the cries of newborns echoed through the local hospital buildings. Mrs. Amara, a wealthy and influential woman, and Mrs. Ogechi, a humble farmer's wife, both gave birth to sons at the same time, but something happened. The joy of childbirth was shadowed by a twist of fate that neither women could have foreseen. Mrs. Amara had always been a woman of pride and high esteem, and always held her head up high whenever she walked through the market square. Her wealth and status evident in every step she takes. When the nurse placed her newborn son in her arms, her heart sunk. The child was an albino, with skin as pale as the full moon and hair as white as fresh cotton wool. In a culture where albinos were often misunderstood, stigmatized, and seen as an abomination creature, Mrs. Amara's disappointment was overwhelming. She had prayed for a strong, healthy son who would carry on her family legacy, not a child who would be looked down upon by the villagers. Dear viewers, what do you think Mrs. Amara will do in such a situation? What will you do if you find yourself in Mrs. Amara's situation, knowing fully well that this is your blood? Before we continue, this is a plea to you, my awesome viewers who haven't subscribed to my channel, to please be a part of the growth of my channel. Yes, click on that subscribe button so you can be part of this channel. And to you, my awesome returning subscribers, how are you doing? Welcome back to yet another interesting story. So guys, let's find out what Mrs. Amara did after she found that she had given birth to an albino. So, as Mrs. Amara stared at her son, an idea began to form in her mind. She glanced across the room to where Mrs. Ogechi lay down, exhausted and sleeping. Her dark-skinned baby boy sleeping in a baby bed beside her. Mrs. Amara, the rich lady's mind raced. What if she could exchange her son with Mrs. Ogechi's son, since she is still unconscious? With her wealth and influence, she would easily arrange it with a particular nurse. The thought took root in her mind, and before long, she had made her decision. Mrs. Amara called the nurse on duty over, a young woman named Nurse Chinyere, who had just started working at the hospital. She knew already that Nurse Chinyere came from a poor family and would do almost anything for money. With a voice dripping with desperation, Mrs. Amara offered Nurse Chinyere a large sum of money to switch the babies. At first, Nurse Chinyere refused because her conscience was battling with her mind with the temptation of money. But she later changed her mind. She said to herself, this might be a lifetime-changing opportunity. The sight of the big naira note in Mrs. Amara's hand won her over, and she agreed. While Mrs. Ogechi was still under the influence of the medication that was given to her to ease her labor pain, Nurse Chinyere made the switch. She placed Mrs. Amara's albino son in Mrs. Ogechi's arm and handed Mrs. Ogechi's son to Mrs. Amara. The deed was done quickly and quietly. With no one else in the hospital aware of what had happened, Mrs. Amara left the hospital with a sense of relief, holding the healthy boy she believed should have been hers. So, few minutes after the deed had been done, Mrs. Amara quickly called her husband to send her the driver to come and take her and the baby home. Because her husband traveled outside the state for a business meeting, she returned to her mansion, ready to raise him in a luxury and comfort upbringing, far away from the judgmental eyes of the villagers. But in the village, rumors spread like wildfire. When Mrs. Ogechi returned home with an albino child, the villagers were quick to gossip. She must have angered the gods, some said, while others said the husband might have committed a terrible sin. This is a curse, others whispered. Albinos were often seen as bad omen. And Mrs. Ogechi found herself and her family shunned by many. Despite the insult and stares, Mrs. Ogechi and her husband Chinedu stood firm. They loved their son unconditionally and named him Chibuike, meaning God is my strength. They worked tirelessly on their farm, determined to give Chibuike the best in life. They told him that he was special, not because of his appearance, but because of his heart and mind. As Chibuike grew, he showed signs of brilliance. He was curious about the world, always asking questions of things and eager to learn. His parents saved every penny to send him to the best school they could afford. Chibuike excelled in his studies, earned the respect of his teachers and eventually the villagers, who began to see him in a new light. Meanwhile, in Mrs. Amara's home, the boy she had taken in through baby exchange, whom she named Ugochukwu, grew up surrounded by wealth but not love. Mrs. Amara was strict and demanding, always pushing Ugochukwu to be the perfect son. But as the time passed, Ugochukwu began to fall ill frequently. He was often weak and tired, with no clear explanation for his ailments. The best doctors were consulted, but none could provide solution. Mrs. Amara's wealth could not buy her son's health, and she became increasingly desperate. One evening, as Mrs. Amara rushed Ugochukwu to the hospital, to the emergency department, she sat beside Ugochukwu, watching him struggle to breathe. Mrs. Amara was consumed by guilt. The memory of the switch haunted her, and she wondered if the gods were punishing her for her deception. She couldn't sleep, her mind tormented by visions of the albino child she had rejected. While in the village, Chibuike's health was robust and he continued to thrive. He was now a young man full of energy and ambition. He dreamed of becoming a doctor, determined to help others just as his parents had helped him. His parents' love and support had given him the confidence to face people around and any challenges, and he was ready to face the world. But the peace in the village was shattered one fateful day when Ugochukwu's condition worsened. Mrs. Amara, desperate for help, consulted a traditional healer who was known for his wisdom and knowledge of ancient remedies. The healer, an old man with eyes that seemed to see into the soul, listened to Mrs. Amara's story. He shook his head and spoke in a low, grieving voice. "You cannot escape the consequence of your action," he said. "The child you took is not yours by blood. and the gods are not pleased. To heal him, you must make amends or else. Terrified Mrs. Amara confessed her crime to the healer, who instructed her to return Ugochukwu to his real parents and take back her albino son. Only then, the healer said, would the gods show mercy. Filled with regrets, Mrs. Amara traveled to the village where Mrs. Ogechi lived. With a lot of searching and questions, she was able to locate Mrs. Ogechi's house, accompanied by the now weak Ugochukwu. When she arrived at Mrs. Ogechi's home, she fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She confessed everything, begging for forgiveness. The villagers who had gathered around were shocked by the revelation. Mrs. Ogechi and her husband Chinedu were stunned but also filled with sorrow for the boy they had raised as their own. They knew they had to do what is right, even if it meant losing Chibuike. But Chibuike, who had overheard everything, stepped forward. "Mother," he said softly to Mrs. Ogechi, "you have always taught me that family is not just about blood, but about love and sacrifice. I love you and father, but if the gods demand this, I will go." The villagers watched in silence as the exchange was made. Chibuike returned to Mrs. Amara, who looked at him with a mist of fear and awe. She had rejected him once, but now she realized that he was her true son, a gift she had been too blind to see. As Chibuike walked away with Mrs. Amara, the villagers could see the pain in his eyes, but they also saw strength and resolve. He was a child of destiny and purpose, and his journey was far from ending. Back in her mansion, Mrs. Amara struggles to connect with Chibuike. She showered him with lots of gifts, but he remained distant. His heart still with the only parents who had raised him. Ugochukwu, now with Mrs. Ogechi, began to recover. His strength returned as the bond with his true mother grew. But Mrs. Amara's wealth could not fill the emptiness in her home. Chibuike, despite his new surrounding, filled with luxury, still felt out of place. He missed the simplicity of the village life, the warmth of his parents' love, and the sense of belonging he had once taken for granted. One day, Chibuike made a decision. He packed his bags and returned to the village, to the home where he had been loved unconditionally. When Mrs. Amara found out, she was heartbroken, but she knew in her heart that she had lost him long ago. Not because of the switch, but because of her own actions in the past. In the village, Chibuike was welcomed back with open arms. Mrs. Ogechi and Chinedu were overjoyed to see their son return, and the villagers who had once shunned them now accepted them even more. As for Mrs. Amara, she lived the rest of her days in regret, her wealth meaningless in the face of the happiness she had sacrificed. She spent her time helping others, hoping to atone for her sins. But the pain of losing both her sons never left her. Chibuike went on to fulfill his dreams of becoming a doctor, using his knowledge and skills to help others, especially those who were disregarded, like he had once been. He never forgot the lesson he had learned, and he always carried with him the love of the parents who had raised him and the wisdom of the journey that had shaped his life. Chibuike, now a fully flagged doctor, had become a beacon of hope in the village. He had set up a small clinic where he treated everyone, regardless of their ability to pay their bills after treatments. His practice grew, and people came from neighboring villages to seek his help. His parents, Ogechi and Chinedu, were proud of the man he had become, knowing that their sacrifice had not been in vain. Meanwhile, Ugochukwu, who had recovered fully, had taken to farming alongside Chinedu. He found solace in the simple life of the village, where he was surrounded by people who accepted him for who he was. Though he was not academically smart like Chinedu, Ugochukwu had a natural talent for the land. The crops he planted flourished, and soon Chinedu's farm became one of the most prosperous in the village. Mrs. Amara, on the other hand, had fallen into a deep depression after Chibuike left her home. Despite all her wealth, her life felt empty. She missed the warmth and joy that Chibuike had brought. Even if it had been brief, she often visited the village, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but she never had the courage to speak to him. She feared he would never forgive her, and the weight of her guilt grew heavier with each passing day. One day, as Chibuike was attending to patients in his clinic, an elderly woman was brought in by her husband and sister. She was weak, with a persistent cough that had worsened over the months. Chibuike immediately recognized her because after the birth and exchange of Chibuike was made open by Mrs. Amara, Mrs. Ogechi took her time to take Chibuike to the hospital where he was born quietly, to show him the nurse that carried out the evil act, without letting the nurse know or pressing charges. Nurse Chinyere, the nurse who had assisted in his birth years back. Life and time had not been kind to her. She looked weak and tired, her eyes filled with sorrow. Nemesis had been dealing with her. Chibuike treated her with the same care and kindness he showed all his patients, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wanted to say, because Nurse Chinyere still recognized Chibuike, the albino child, very well. After her treatment, Chinyere requested to speak with Chibuike in private. "Dr. Chibuike," she began, her voice trembling, "I have carried a burden inside of me for many years. I need to confess something before it is too late." Chibuike listened attentively as Nurse Chinyere recounted the events of his birth, confirming what Mrs. Amara had confessed years earlier. She explained how she had been driven by desperation and greed to switch him with Ugochukwu, and how that decision had haunted her every day since then. Tears streamed down her face as she begged for his forgiveness. Chibuike was silent for a long time, processing the revelation. He had known about the switch, but hearing it from Chinyere made the pain fresh again. Yet, as he looked at the woman before him, broken by her guilt, he realized that holding on to anger would only contribute the circle of pain. His parents had taught him the power of forgiveness, and he knew what he had to do. "I forgive you, Nurse Chinyere," Chibuike said softly. placing a hand on her shoulder. What's done is done. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we move forward. Chinyere broke down in tears, overwhelmed by his compassion. She thanked him repeatedly, her heart lighter than it had been in years past. She left the clinic that day with a sense of peace, knowing that she had finally made amends. Words of Chibuike's forgiveness spread quickly through the village, reaching the ears of Mrs. Amara. She was deeply moved by his kindness and courage, and it gave her the strength to do what she had been too afraid to do for so long. She decided to visit Chibuike's clinic not as a rich woman seeking forgiveness, but as a mother who had wronged her child and was desperate to make things right. When Mrs. Amara arrived at the clinic, she was hesitant. The villagers eyed her with curiosity, some with disregard, remembering the events that had transpired years ago. But she pressed on, entertaining the small, modest building where Chibuike was busy with patients. Chibuike looked up from his work and was surprised to see Mrs. Amara standing in the doorway. She appeared older than he remembered, her once proud conduct and character softened by years of regret. "Chibuike," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I must ask for it anyways. I was wrong to switch you at birth, and I have lived with that mistake every day. I know I cannot undo the harm I have caused, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am." Chibuike studied her for a moment, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. He had never harbored hatred for her, only sadness for what could have been of him. He stood up and walked over to her, taking her hands in his. "I forgive you, Mrs. Amara," he said. Only sadness for what could have been of him. He stood up and walked over to her, taking her hands in his. "I forgive you, Mrs. Amara," he said, echoing the words he had spoken to Chinyere. "My life turned out the way it did because of that switch, but I've found peace with it. What's important now is how we choose to live the rest of our lives." Tears gushing in Mrs. Amara's eyes as she embraced Chibuike, the son she had rejected, whom have shown her more kindness than she believed she deserved. It was a moment of healing for both of them, and for the first time in years, Mrs. Amara felt some level of hope. After that day, Mrs. Amara became a regular visitor to the village. She worked alongside with Chibuike in his clinic, using her resources to help fund medical supplies and improve the facilities. She also supported Ugochukwu and Chinedu's farming endeavors, investing in their farm and helping it grow even more prosperous. The villagers who had once ignored and rejected Mrs. Ogechi and her family now looked up to them with respect and admiration. The farm thrived, the clinic grew, and the bond between the two families strengthened. But life in Umuaja was not without a challenge. One evening, as the sun set over the lush field, a group of strangers arrived in the village. They were led by a man named Eze, a self-proclaimed spiritual leader who claimed to have visions of the future. He was tall, with piercing eyes that seemed to look into a person's very soul, and his presence commanded attention. Eze's followers were many, and they spoke of his ability to heal the sick and communicate with the gods. They set up camp on the outskirts of the village. And soon, villagers began to visit Eze, seeking his guidance and blessing. At first, Eze seemed harmless, performing simple ritual and offering words of wisdom. But as time went on, his influence grew, and he began to speak out against the presence of the clinic, claiming that modern medicine was an insult to the gods of the land. He warned the villagers that their belief and confidence on Chibuike's clinic would bring misfortune upon them. Some villagers were influenced by Eze's charisma, and they began to believe him. They stopped visiting the clinic, turning to Eze for healing. Chibuike noticed the decline in patients, but refused to be discouraged. He knew that his work was important and that he was truly helping people. However, tensions in the village began to rise. Those who still believed in the clinic fought with Eze's followers, and the once peaceful village became divided because of Eze's charisma. Eze, detecting an opportunity to consolidate the power, declared that the only way to appease the gods was to drive Chibuike and his clinic out of the village. One night, a group of Eze's followers gathered outside the clinic, fortified with torches and weapons. They demanded that Chibuike leaves the village, accusing him of bringing curse upon the village. The situation quickly escalated, and confrontation seemed inevitable. But before violence could erupt, Ugochukwu and Chinedu arrived, leading a group of villagers who supported the clinic. They stood between the mob and the clinic, refusing to let harm come to Chibuike or the work he was doing. "Enough!" Ugochukwu shouted, his voice resounding through the night. "Chibuike has done nothing but help this village. He is my brother, and I will not stand by and let anyone harm him." The gang hesitated, uncertain of what to do. Eze stepped forward, his eyes tightening as he looked at Ugochukwu. "The gods have spoken," he said coldly. "If you stand with him, you too will suffer their wrath." But Ugochukwu did not back down. "The gods did not demand harm," he replied. "They demand justice and kindness. If you believe otherwise, then it is you who are mistaken." At that moment, Chibuike stepped out of the clinic, standing beside Ugochukwu. "I am here to help, not to harm," he said calmly. "If you believe in what I do, then stand with me. If not, then let us part ways in peace." The villagers, who had once been part of Eze's gang, began to waver, their anger cooling as they saw the unity and courage of the brothers. Slowly, they lowered their torches and weapons, realizing that they had been led astray by fear and misconception. Eze, seeing his influence sliding away, tried one last time, gathering his followers, but it was too late. The villagers turned their back on him. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Joy of the African Tales by Joy. If you haven't subscribed, please click on that subscribe button. Put on your post notification bell so you always get notified anytime I post a new one here. Like and also share this video. Thank you for supporting my channel. I do not take your support for granted. Don't forget to leave a comment in the comment section.